Thanks for coming to this week's Rough Cuts. We have two water Rough Cuts back-to-back. Next week, we're going to have John LaFave from Tech talking about groundwater, so I invite you to that too. But we're very happy today to have Michael Downey, who's the water planner in the Water Resource Division at DNRC. Let me give you a little bit of bio on Michael. He grew up on a cattle ranch in a remote part of Nevada and then went and got his bachelor's degree in English literature from the University of Oregon. Then he moved to San Francisco and he was a freelance photographer and he had assignments all over the world. Then he went and got his master's degree in environmental law and policy from Vermont Law School and moved to Helena to work for the DNRC in the Water Resources Division. In 2003, he returned to the private sector and spent 10 years working in land conservation as a land steward and GIS coordinator for the Montana Land Reliance. And then in 2013, returned to the DNRC. So quite an interesting history, and I turn it over to you. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. If you didn't grab one, when you came in, here is the hard copy of the Montana State Water Plan. They are available on, it's obviously online. I'm kind of old school in that I like to be able to put my hands on things every now and then, as opposed to being trapped to my computer. So today, I'm just going to give you, we're just going to talk about the State Water Plan. Talk about the State Water Plan and the process that we went through and some of the challenges that process presented. And then I think that we'll also, I want to touch on the opportunities that have, now that the State Water Plan is done and out, and what opportunities that provides, and really the opportunities that provides for you as student and in faculty in the academic setting. Really, for State Water Plan, just a brief history. Montana really got into water planning with the passage of the Montana Water Resources Act. And up until that time, there was some planning that had been done with various boards that had been created. There was a planning effort that was really a federal process through the 60s. But it was at that time, that's also when DNRC was created, and I'm kind of always amazed when you look at the legislation that came out of that era, including our Constitution. We're really fortunate that we had some really visionary people at the legislature at that time, and here they obviously they absolutely got the importance of water planning and the importance of water to our state. So really, with that direct mandate in legislation directing DRC to create a state water plan. There was in 1976. I'm just going to run through this briefly. There was this Montana Framework Report that kind of looked at how we might do water planning in the state, given the work that had gone on before that. But it was expensive, and it really didn't get a lot of traction. And so in '87, with all these years of the water planning statute being on the books and not really much of anything getting done, they came up with a revised approach in which it was a really issue-oriented effort in which they picked a variety of issues, the ones that you see there, the ag water use efficiency, water information, the groundwater plan, hydropower, in-stream flow. So they picked an issue, and then it was a collection. These were really technocratic efforts that were done by policymakers and certainly researchers, and they put together this document on in-stream flow that would lay out, well, and the legislature should do this, this, and this, and here you go. And that was received with a very collective ho-hum. So, you know, and I think that the part of it was those documents were put together. They're technical documents that were put together by technical people, and they didn't make that leap that I think that a planning document needs to make to both the public and the policymakers as to why they should care. And so that approach really went on through the for more than 10 years, and then you saw in the late 90s with the that's where we had the watershed groups, and that's where you know, some of your early watershed groups. The Clark Fork Task Force was certainly one of them that was named, and you saw a prevalence of watershed groups popping up around the state, and really the water planning effort became an effort of supporting all of those different groups. In 2009, the legislature, and actually it was an outgoing legislator, it was an outgoing chief of the Management Bureau that kind of got together and said, wow, we have, in '73 they told us we were supposed to do a state water plan, and really, I mean, even when I applied for this job a couple of years ago, and I said, well, I probably, if I'm going to do this, I should probably familiarize myself with the state water plan, and of course, there really wasn't a state plan. I mean, there wasn't one. And so the 2009 legislature got in the business, and they directed DNRC very clearly that they needed to present a state water plan, and they laid out a number of issues that needed to be addressed and gave them a deadline of January 2015 to deliver a report. And so certainly a big one of those was an inventory of consumptive and non-consumptive uses. Here I associate with existing water rights, but really, I mean, as we got into it, it's like, wow, I don't know if we can really even say take the water rights out of it. Just an inventory of consumptive and non-consumptive uses it's a big deal. Along with that, an analysis of the effects of drought and increased depletions on water, both groundwater and surface water. And then how do we deal with some of the new demands for water sources? Certainly, industrial uses is probably the biggest one that we, you know, kind of looming on the horizon in Montana. I don't think that particularly a new one, but one that we're still going to have to deal with is, you know, if you look at what's happened with the other states, certainly domestic water use is a big one. You know, you think about the Clark Fork and the water demands on that system, which are really the Clark Fork is a closed basin, and with Missoula at, I don't know, what is it 80,000 people, something like that. So now let's think of the Missoula area with 500,000 or with 1 million people, and suddenly domestic use, which is really what's driving water policy in all of your other certainly western states, is going to become a really big issue in Montana as well. But I don't know if I said this. Please, if you got questions, just shout them out. I'd rather that this were kind of an interactive exchange as opposed to me just up here talking to you. So the central questions is that the water that's legally and physically available to meet existing and future needs, and what are Montana's current and future water resource needs. The objectives laid out in the plan were to document current water supply and demand, Clark Fork, Yellowstone, Missouri River Basin, and those increase over the next 20 years. Now, the other part of all of that the legislature directed us to do was complicated by the fact that they told us that we had to do this with the use of 4 basin advisory councils. And this ended up being, I think, was really the issue that, you remember, this started in 2009. We didn't really get going full swing on this planning effort until the spring of 2013. And so there was a number of years where we had this directive out there, and it's like, well, what do we do about it? And what do we especially do about these basin advisory councils that they said that 20-member basin advisory councils, how do we pull this together and run this? and run this in a way that's actually going to be productive. And I think that that was really the biggest challenge of this whole process of pulling together the state water plan was running that part of it. The legislation actually divided the state into the Yellowstone, the Missouri, and the Clark Fork basins. We split the upper Missouri and the lower Missouri. You can see in the green there, separating the lower Missouri, we separated it really at the Marias, at the confluence of the Marias and the Missouri rivers, because that represents, the area in green represents a closed basin. And so certainly your opportunities for water planning and water management are very different in a closed basin versus one that's open. Yeah.
You better explain what.
Yes, I was just about to do that. And a closed basin means that it's closed to new appropriations. So that means that if you're looking to get a water right to do really anything besides domestic and stock water use, in that basis, a surface water right, that you essentially you can't do it. You can change a water right, but you can't get a new water right. So how that affects your demand, or how that affects your ability to respond to demands, is certainly changes things. I think that both with the Basin Advisory Councils, and just when you start looking at the state, all right, we're going to do this planning effort that's going to really look at things on a basin level. Just the geography of what you're dealing with becomes a challenge. I ran the process in the lower Missouri and in the Clark Fork, and in the lower Missouri, just to have a meeting was at least a 3.5-hour drive if you met in the middle for everyone. And so that really created some challenges for us. So the 20-member Citizens Council, these people were distributed across the basin, and to provide us with input on how best to manage and develop water in those areas. They made recommendations to DNRC. They were an advisory group, so they didn't have veto authority. They couldn't tell us that this is what you should put in the state water plan. They were strictly an advisory group. But there was also, it was very clear, both from the legislation and the way that we set those up, that they were going to have, that they needed to have a meaningful involvement. And so I think that the challenge with that is how do you create a process that really engages those people in putting together a water plan with recommendations that they're vested in, that they feel like is really theirs and has their imprint on, but then they give that to the DNRC, and we come out with a state water plan that they can feel like, okay, they listen to us. They really listen to what we had to say. And remember that we had, if I go back, so we were going to do this in 4 different basins. And so in addition to turning out the Montana State Water Plan, while we were doing that, we were also turning out these basin plans in each one of those basins. And so that when we got to the point of doing the water plan, we had 212 different recommendations from a citizen advisory board on the direction that water policy should go in the state. And so then we had to take that and bring that all together, and it was hard. Let me just say that to get the 212 recommendations that were really done on a basin level, and then try to apply that on a statewide level and still kind of make them feel like they were vested in what went on, wasn't an easy process. And I think that go ahead.
Well, I just wondered who was on what types of people were on your council.
It was probably the most diverse group of stakeholders that we had ever kind of collected in terms of the the representation of these 80 different people. So we had people from ag, we had people from conservation, we had people from municipalities, we had tribal involvement in all of the advisory councils. We really, you know, we really went all out in terms of trying to make these councils the most as diverse as possible. All right, where was I? So in terms of bringing this document together, I think that one of it really hinged on one of the critical features of that was that we decided to hire facilitators to run the process. And what that did, the critical thing in terms of, we actually took some, because it was expensive, and we took some criticism. It's like, well, what do you planners do? Why don't you just run that process? And really, what it enabled us to do is it enabled us to have this kind of an arm's length relationship with these basin advisory councils, in which they were able to kind of go forth and do good things, and they had their facilitator. And so we weren't necessarily running the process. I mean, in point of fact, we had planning teams set up for each one of these basins, and it was the planning teams working with the facilitator that really directed the process. But it really enabled us to say, it's like, all right, this is your process, guys. And I think had we been in that facilitation role, it would have been very difficult to pull off, if not impossible. So the planning process was broken up into 3 phases. Phase 1, which was a scoping effort, which in just trying to go out, and we had listening sessions where we went out and held public meetings around the state to just hear what are the issues of importance to the citizens of the state. In hindsight, you know, I think that probably what we should have done is we probably should have done some kind of a draft document for people then to respond to, because I think that in a lot of ways the public kind of did get it, and it was kind of like, yeah, what is the state water plan? Why should I care? And I think had we had a draft document with even draft recommendations, then people would have said, whoa, I don't, yeah, and they would have been more engaged. After that process, we came up with a scoping document that helped us through the process, but in terms of citizen involvement, there wasn't as much as we would have liked. And the phase 2 really was looking at those issues that had been identified, and then we had a series of technical sessions to try to, I mean, part of it was just trying to take a citizen advisory council and get them up to speed with regard to both the technical and policy issues, so that they could engage in meaningful dialogue and frankly, and give us a meaningful product. Because it's complicated stuff. And the phase 3 was then kind of taking those recommendations developed by those groups and then transforming those into the state water plan. And so part of the challenge I think we faced was even getting people to get what the whole idea of water planning is, and why we do it, and why is it important. And so really, I mean, if you look in some basins, there's been a lot more planning than others. This is a map of the Big Hole, in which there's been quite a lot of planning done over the years. And you know, it was great to be able to have some of those examples that we could fall back on. It's like, okay, this is why you care. And as time went on, I think that, you know, everybody, they really got it, and they really got that this is all right. This is the way. If you look at certainly, you know, places like the Blackfoot, where they've got this great program in which they really do have a drought management plan in place, and yearly really on pretty much almost an annual basis. They have to engage and use that plan, and there's shared sacrifice and all of those things that I think that even though that we tend to have this fallback, it's like, well, we've got the prior appropriation doctrine, and we can enforce water rights, and we can it's basically it's all based on seniority, and really at the end of it, that's not how water is managed in Montana. It might be managed that way, and I can't say with regard to other states, but really that's not the way it's managed at all. And there are ditch riders, everything from water commissioners to ditch riders on the ground, that they kind of go around and they work things out. And having that, and water planning provides the context to get that done. As well as finally just that process for collecting data and input for development of policy recommendations. So I guess the other really important component to making the state water plan was we also developed we developed one of these documents, which was a basin water plan, which we were doing alongside the state water plan. Really, these were being done first, and all of the information in these plans fed into the state water plan. But this was also a huge element in terms of that Basin Advisory Council ownership in the work that they were doing. That was, I think, really critical to the process working. So that at least then they had a document that they really had their fingerprints all over. Even though this was done, certainly written by planners and hydrologists, but through the iterations of several drafts that they were able to provide input on. Yeah. They did. They did. These are. He was referring to a conversation that we had earlier, in which certainly there was some complaints with hydrologists that there were not enough hydrographs in this document, and so yes, they did. And in this document, as you can see, this was pretty weighty. Our goal for this originally was to keep this to 60 pages. I think it's 85 pages, but it was really, we felt like in order for this to be an effective document, it had to be really, really trimmed down and succinct and to the point. But anyway, so that was, I guess, the other part that was going on behind as we were kind of, wrangling this process, was that they had these other basin plans that really were their own documents, and I think that had we not had that part of it, we would have gotten more pushback, because it would have been like, well, you didn't listen. And in fact, and that came up even in the context of several meetings following, even when the state water plan did come out, and it's like, well, where did you guys get these recommendations? Because of course the recommendations that they had for their basins really were basin centric, and we were tasked with creating a state water plan that had a statewide reach. So we couldn't really take things verbatim, and let's face it, there were 4 different groups and 80 of them and 212 recommendations, and we didn't want to throw all of that out there. So it really, those basin plans really were critical in terms of how that process went. So if I have a regret with regard to the state water plan, and in some ways I think that you could say that was also the strength of the process, it was really abbreviated. In the lower Missouri, we had our first kickoff meeting with our Basin Advisory Group, and I think that there was, Jamie, you were on the upper Missouri group. It was in early October. I think maybe you guys were late September of 2013. And so and so you can see when you look at the milestones, and so we were starting in October, and we were going to have a 50% draft complete by February 15th. There were several people that said, you can't do this. It's not possible. You cannot do this. I had the advantage of working in one of my prior jobs was working for Collins Publishers on the Day in the Life series of books, and where we put out a big coffee table book on a different state or country. And in that case, I mean, we went from a group talking about a book on March 15th to we had a 200-page hardbound coffee table book in the stores for Thanksgiving. So I think that the benefit of this also was, and that's why I refer to this as being one of the strengths of the project, was people, we weren't dragging our feet. And so as a result, the citizens that were involved in the process, I mean, I think that they were able to see progress on a regular basis. And it's like, and I think, there was some discomfort on their part that, wow, this is moving really, really, really fast. I would have loved to have been able to inject another 12 months anyway into this process. I think that, but by the same token, and this is not to berate that process, Colorado had 13, had a similar, our plan was our process was kind of modeled on Colorado's, in which they had 13 Basin Advisory Councils that had been meeting for 8 years, and they just recently came out. They actually just about the same time as this plan came out. They came out with their state water plan. So it was a much more extended process, and I think that I'm just amazed at how a level of commitment that people, I don't know, and Jamie, maybe you could comment on that. Because you were on the Upper Missouri Basin Advisory Council, correct? Yeah.
Technical advisor, and then I also sat in on the Yellowstone Basin.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that was something that really struck me. Was that people have to drive great distances, 1 to 2-day meetings, sometimes overnight.
Right.
So this is amazing. And people were just being reimbursed for their travel, really.
That's correct. It was otherwise it was entirely voluntary. And so really, when you look at the number of hours, and I think that it speaks to the resource that I think that I'm not saying that we had our process all perfectly figured out. I wish we did. I think we got really lucky, but I think that it really does speak to what you can do with a citizen-driven effort if you really get your process right, and I think we lucked out, frankly, given the way things could have gone. So that was really the state water plan by the numbers in terms of what we did. There were 36 meetings statewide, nearly 60 days of Basin Advisory Council meetings. I did a little computation on what that comes up to for how would you like those for your in-kind hours on your latest grant application? So it was really, there was a tremendous amount of citizen input into this document. And I think, and that's really what has separated it from those earlier efforts that I talked about, where we had that were very focus driven, and they were really very, very top down. And we got some pushback on a number of those documents, and a lot of people, where did this come from? And we really didn't get any of that. And of course, through this most recent session, of course, through the process, we were updating the Water Policy Interim Committee, so we had a legislative committee that was looking at various drafts and that we were updating on a regular basis. I think that to a certain degree, we lucked out in that there was the water compact. There was a water compact in Medicaid that took a lot of attention. I'm sure that there were any number of issues in the legislature this go around that kind of were able to fly under the radar because of the compact in Medicaid, which I don't know if well, we can talk about that later. I can update you on where things are with the compact. But really, there was this great public effort, and in this document that we put out, I think that given the lessons from the earlier planning efforts, there really from the word get-go was that there was a desire to make this a very accessible document that people could read and was readable and that they wanted to look at. Shall I?
What are your plans for updating it, or is it updatable, or is it a dynamic document come out every 2 years? And are you data stages and supporting it in stable and that kind of thing?
We do have that, but in terms of the plan itself, I mean, the thought right now is 10 years. That we'll go through a similar process again. That process will be easier next time because, frankly, it was kind of new. It was new territory for DNRC, and with the effort that had been put to supporting watersheds, I think we'd kind of forgotten how to do a state water plan, and forgotten what that meant. And so I think that the next go around will be much easier to do. The other thing that we wanted to make, and that I think that we were successful with this, was to develop recommendations that are quite pointed, and in terms of where we're trying to go with the recommendations. And I think that we had a conversation earlier this morning with a number of the faculty talking about how the university system can certainly better work with DNRC and what this might mean for them. And I think that all through this document, we spell out opportunities for research and investment. There are recommendations that are really quite pointed. A lot of them are even with regard to research. If there was one thing that came out of the state water plan, I think that the biggest was just the need for better data. The need for better data and for better information. People are amazed all the time when you go around, it's like, we don't really measure our water. Some places they do, but really if you look statewide, we don't measure our water very well. We certainly do on our larger rivers, and USGS has their network of gauges that we all depend on. But for our smaller tribs, we don't. DNRC has launched an effort. We're installing 10 gauges this year. The idea is to have 100 gauges statewide, a network of 100 gauges statewide that'll offer real-time data, and this is all on smaller tribs, to provide better information. But yeah, I do think that the water information and data component, in going through this process, we really realized that we've got a lot of work to do. And I think that that's certainly another area that's absolutely ripe for involvement with the university system. I'm here. I'm already to questions, and we can. And I'd actually even still like to talk some about just about the document and what we put in there and maybe did not put in there. I also wanted to give you my contact information, but please, question.
So what's in it for the participants in terms of actual policy changes, and what recommendations are there about policy, and what happens from here with regard to beyond recommended data collection and that kind of stuff?
So I'm sorry, so what's in it for the participants?
Well, I guess just back up. It'd be interesting to hear how you would describe what happens with policy and how this articulates that. And then I guess from a broader perspective on citizen-based resource management, long processes or short processes that develop a lot of recommendations, often develop a lot of recommendations.
And that's it.
And that's it.
Right.
So it's great that this was successful and people committed a lot, but as we start to layer on more and more of these processes, I wonder how people who participate in them understand the benefits of them. And
right.
One of them might be policy changes, but there may be other things.
Yeah. You know, and let me, I would say that's a multifaceted question. So let me first talk about the policy portion of it. You know, in terms of timing, you know, that was another unfortunate aspect of this project. It would have been really great if they'd given us a deadline of January of 2014, and which would have been a year before the legislature started. Because for this session, I don't know if you know how that works, but by the time this document came out, in terms of agency policy recommendations, that horse had left the barn last spring. There's a whole, what they call an EPP process, Nikki, that's the, what is it, is the EPP is the EPP process that we have to respond to. Surely you've had to respond to that. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, exactly. But anyway, if you have a policy, it's how a policy recommendation kind of gets packaged. Because ultimately, as an agency, we are a creature of the executive branch. So we really don't do anything on our own. DNRC can't decide what policy recommendations or what policy initiatives that we want to move forward. We do that with the blessing of the governor's office. So there's a whole process whereby we go through that, and it moves up the chain and then goes to the governor's office, and they say yes, you can do that, and so it's involved. And so, you know, I think that probably one of the disappointing things for participants in this was that, all right, so where's all right, we talked about all these great things that we want to do, but there's no legislation, you know. And so I think that so in terms of making that meaningful, we're just dealing with, all right, how do we given the budget constraints that we have, how do we take this document and make those recommendations into an integral part of what we do? And so I really think that for DNRC Water Resources, this document is going to drive what we do for the next 10 years, without a doubt.
With the increased amount of information that came through in the process that was mentioned, have you seen a change in the power structure of the different sectors that are at the table because of that information?
You know, I'm going to say I think that's yet to be seen. I mean, remember, this document just came out in January, but I do think that in terms of some of the information, this is certainly has laid the groundwork for what could be some really interesting discussions going down the road. For example, I think that, in fact, Wyatt and I were talking about this earlier. I think that you often hear it's like, well, we've got all this water, and you know, and 98% of it's just flowing out of the state. You know, why do we got to use that water better here in Montana for Montanans? Well, guess what? If you look at what's driving in most of our large watersheds, what's driving water flows is hydropower. There is the Clark Fork Basin so the Clark Fork Basin here in Pink and in Kootenai, that basin is a closed basin. The reason that basin is closed is not because there's not enough water in the Clark Fork. We drive by and I'm always amazed as you get farther down. It's like, wow, this is a big river. But it's limited by a water right at Noxon by the Avista Corporation, and really if you look at their water right of 50,000 cubic feet per second at Noxon, they have a year-round water right of 50 feet per second. Well, there's only 2 weeks in an average year. There's only 2 weeks out of the year where the flow is over 50,000 CFS. So what's limiting? So I think that to get back to your question is that some of those light bulbs are going to start to go on, and it's not. I mean, it's not surprising. I mean, if you look at states like California and Arizona and Colorado, what's happened is that they've created a priority for beneficial uses. In Montana, there is no priority for beneficial uses. One beneficial use, whatever it is, whether it's ag, whether it's municipal, whatever it is on the same playing field as any other beneficial use. In California and Arizona, and I mean, and the list would go on and on, there is a priority. California, it's domestic water use. Ag is second, hydropower is third. So if I was hydro, and I and I looked at some of the figures that are in here, I'd be nervous. I probably shouldn't be saying that. We are on air. Huh? But yeah, so I think that those are probably some of the discussions, to get back to your question, that probably that may well likely come out of this kind of a process, because we certainly put a light onto that. Yeah.
I was a facilitator in the upland.
Oh, you look.
I want to say, of how abbreviated you think the process was, it was incredibly organic.
It was.
And I think even though it was kind of really pushed through quickly, the work that the people on the were so dedicated. And I guess my question is, do you see that the use of the facts, like annually, to inform kind of the quick updates of the state water plan? Because those groups were so tuned in, and even though they had really disparate viewpoints, they came together and created great recommendations. And it seems like those groups over the next 10 years would be great.
You know, and I unfortunately I had we had a request for $200,000 to maintain those basin advisory councils, you know, over the biennium and carry that kind of that planning process forward. That was stripped out of the governor's budget, sadly. And you know, and there again, I think part of it is because it's like, for water planning, what is that? But I think you're right that it was a really organic. You know, it was a really pretty amazing process, and I was involved in all four, and they were really similar across the board. So I think that's one of the questions that we have moving forward, is because I think you're absolutely right. It'd be a shame to kind of lose that energy in that organization that was developed through those basin advisory councils. Moving forward, in terms of how that's actually going to get done, I don't know yet, but that's certainly on our, you know, on the list of, okay, how do we do this, you know, kind of with no budget. So.
In writing the document, how did you navigate around the topic of climate change? You know, you call it climate variability.
Yeah.
You talk about
there was a lot of I don't know. I think I did manage to get climate change, like I don't know. I think I might have snuck it in there one point, because it was like, all right, we can talk about climate variability, but we're not doing the change thing. And the
Who told you that?
Well,
Where did you get that?
that came from the Water Policy Interim Committee, and so there was an interim committee that was, you know, that's bipartisan, and I think it's an equal split. And that was made pretty clear that we didn't want to go down that path. And so, but but by the same token, you know, you have the whole, you know, we have the legislature, oh, wrong way. The legislature had told us that they wanted to, you know, what are the analysis of effects of drought and increased depletions on water availability? I mean, AKA climate change. I mean, and so really, so we did it, we really did it in the context of, all right, so looking at drought, and that's why if you look at some of our comparisons, you know, we looked at the drought in the 30s and drought in the 2000s, and tried to look at and then looked at water storage and how that affected water storage and kind of what would the effect. So what's the effect of a protracted type of drought that we had in the 30s? What would that effect have on water storage? And so that's how we did it. You know, you just you know, you just kind of do your best to talk about it without calling it what it is. And I think that became the way that we felt like we had to deal with it, was like, all right, we know this is out there, so how do we address it without raising people's hackles with the whole climate change thing? Yeah.
I was just thinking, because Greg also did, I know for the Yellowstone Basin, Tama gave a presentation, but I don't know how that was worked out in other basins that are, like, getting the Basin Advisory Council themselves up to speed on climate change and impacts. And you gave one presentation, but maybe not all four basins.
Right.
I do keep working with folks like Chuck Dalby and down Wyoming, Sue Lowry, and they're great folks to work with.
Oh, yeah.
And super receptive.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and so you know, but it was similar for the different basin advisory councils, and that was really part of that phase 2, that whole technical transfer portion of it. I'm sorry, you.
Yeah, I was wondering how the Environmental Quality Council.
You know, and yeah, and they really weren't. I mean, Tim Davis, certainly he reports to EQC, and they are aware of the document. But and the Water Policy Interim Committee is kind of a subcommittee of EQC, and so that was kind of split off, and that was their baby, and so that's for the most part where that went.
I haven't read it closely, of course, but it seems to be really focused on water quantity.
It is.
So what about the 303D list for the Clean Water Act? A lot of rivers are impaired under that list, and mostly impaired by ag use.
Well, you know, and part of it is that we've got a state structure that's totally goofy. I actually started my first job in water resources was with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, and in a lot of places, water quantity and water quality are not split. In Montana, they are, and it's completely goofy. And we actually had there was a water quality component that was in this document that, well, the response at one of the water policy interim committees was that the wheels are coming off the bus of the state water planning process. And there's all this, and the Farm Bureau was, because we were taking on water quality. And really, I mean, and if you look at the lower Missouri and their issues with oil and gas development, I mean, I personally, now I'm going to get on my little lower Missouri soapbox, which I think is one of the more pressing environmental justice issues that we've seen in a while, which is that if we had the kind of development going on in the Gallatin Valley, do you think that there'd be more interest, and that we might have, and there'd be more restrictions, and there'd be more? But because it's in the far northeastern corner, in an area where probably most of the people are a little suspicious of going anyway, you know, all hands are off, and it really is. I mean, once you start peeling back the layers, you kind of can't believe it. But got sidetracked. What was it? The
303D.
No, the truth. So anyway, there was in this water quality component, and we said water quality is the bailiwick of DEQ, and that's how we deal with the report. And so, and you'll actually go through in this report, we kind of refer back to DEQ, and we kind of couldn't touch it, which is unfortunate. Because I think that also in hindsight, really, this should have been the Montana State Water Quantity Plan. I mean, you're absolutely right that it really neglects a huge critical piece of the puzzle.
Are there efforts now from DEQ to produce something similar to quality?
You know, I don't think so. I mean, the 319 program put out an annual report. You know, the 319 program really is the program that does their TMDL that basically implements the TMDL program in the state. And they put it right. They've got a non-point source, the statewide non-point source plan. You know, I think that you know, another environmental justice issue. If you look at the TMDL planning and where it's gone on in the state and where it hasn't, well, it's kind of Bozeman, Helena, Missoula centric, and to their credit, I think they've recognized that, and they're doing more work out east.
And that was in their defense because of a lot.
Mm-hmm.
They were forced to do that.
Right.
They were sued and they hadn't finished those.
Right. Right. Yeah.
How do you guys handle tribal water compacts?
Well, or tribal water compacts generally, or the Salish Kootenai.
Are they referenced? Or
They are. They are, and that's really why. And that's really why we had tribal involvement in all those processes. I think there was probably less in the Upper Missouri than others, whereas the others we really had, and we had the tribe. And in the Upper Missouri, they were certainly invited. I mean, you've got to work to get the tribes. It's a lot of work to get the tribes involved. And I spent in the Lower Missouri. I spent a whole bunch of time at the front end, kind of getting them going, and you've got to go and you've got to meet with them on their own ground. I mean, I think that we're often thrown by tribal relations because we kind of figure that they work just the way they work for everybody else, and then they don't. And so, in terms of the compact, I mean, the only compact that's outstanding was certainly the Salish Kootenai compact, and we just didn't touch it because in Clark Fork. When running that process, I mean, it was like, okay, we can spend the next 6 months, 9 months, 10 months, however many months you want to do it, we can spend arguing about the compact, and frankly, we had people that were very strong compact supporters on that group, and we had others that were leading the charge against it. And so it's like, we have no way of affecting the compact. We are not, the negotiating team is not taking any recommendations from us. We didn't touch it. And I felt like it was the only way that we could do that and move forward and address all of the other many issues that we had to address, was really not to touch it. In the other basins, I mean, I think that with the water compacts, they're a water user just like the rest of us, and that's the benefit of those compacts being in place, is that they are stakeholders with water rights, like any other stakeholder with water rights. And so it was interesting. Probably one of our the Fort Peck was probably of all the tribes was probably the most involved in the water planning process, which I would not have guessed.
The legislation dictated the use of the act, but was there any discussion about broader how to preserve that water, and if not, is there potential for that?
You know, I think there really was not. There wasn't, you know, we had, 26 public meetings around the state. I don't know, I think we spent something to the tune of $50,000 just on advertising for the state water plan. The comments and the public involvement, it was really hit and miss in the Clarkport. In some of the processes, we had great involvement. In others, not so much. I think that the biggest challenge that I felt like I had in that process, and in terms of engaging the public, was trying to figure out how. Frankly, it's how. I'll tell you what, taking ads in the paper and having something on the evening news and even a radio interview doesn't get it done. I mean, I don't know how many, we'd have meetings even in a little town like Glasgow and have, 12 people show up and they're like, well, didn't you guys, wasn't this advertised in the paper? Yes, it was advertised in the paper.
There's a project that we're involved with that has the benefit of a rural sociologist who's very, very adept at what he does.
It's all right.
The structure of that was that we have these advisory committees, 2 of them that have different purposes. And the insights from those groups have been incredibly valuable for detail and direct research. Two-way learning that creates statistical research. But the other element of that was a statistically rigorous public survey of farmers in the basin that we're working in. And what that allows you to do is put statistics on the broader perception and then fill in the meat behind that with the comments that come from the individual committees or the.
Well, and I think that's a great example of how, certainly the university system can help us do our jobs better. Because I think that probably you're right, is a really pointed survey where you're knocking on doors and getting people that's how you engage people. I mean, to get people to meetings, we found it was like good old-fashioned phone trees. You call somebody on the phone, and that's how they find out, because your traditional ways just don't work.
I think it potentially is also interesting in the context of trying to affect policy. Because if you can put statistics on public perception around issues, then you might be more likely to affect legislators' perception.
I think that's probably right. Wow, we have reached the end of our time.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. This is great. And
All right.
we hope to see you again.
All right, thank you.